This program is presented and distributed by Keep the Faith on the web at www.keepthefaith.org.
The world is already being assembled into camps. And if you ask me, who will compose the camps? Democrats versus Republicans, Lutherans versus Catholics, even communists versus capitalists, I say no. There might be an external banner of communism versus the external banner of capitalism. I say the real camps will be the atheists versus the theists. That this, to me, it seems to me, all history, all philosophy, all journalism, all conflict, point to this, that we are rapidly assembling our armies, as it were, the only problem being the atheistic army is enormous. And one wonders where we're going to recruit the theists. But if the theists have not an army, at least they'll have populations which can be enslaved and dehumanized by the atheists. Now, atheism is still a harsh word. It would be very, very unpopular if I started an atheist society. Oh, it's being done. The audacity of the atheist gets worse and worse, but until relatively recently, you didn't go around pushing atheism. Much better to use a code word. It's much better to use a word which has a semantic value highly attractive. Say, humanism. Who could be against humanism? It's got all the advantages and many, many advantages which seem to be a blessing to anyone who suffered from religion and piety and the like. Therefore, when I speak now about the religion of secular humanism, I am really speaking about atheism. And that's not my word. I'll read from their official document. So we are talking about a movement which pushes man. When you say you are a humanist without further qualification, all you need mean is you are interested in the welfare of man. Now, that's very good. I should hope I am a humanist in that sense. But the humanism which is dominating every school, almost every school, which absolutely has captured the educational process in the public schools and bids fair to capture the process in our own parochial schools, is secular humanism. They still won't say atheistic in their title, but that's what they mean. So that is the humanism. You know, there is such a thing as biblical humanism. There is such a thing as some people say, and one would wonder what it would mean, Marxist humanism. It sounds like an obscenity, that juxtaposition. There is this secular humanism. So I would say that the coming camps, the coming division in the world will be between the atheists, however disguised they are, and they will become more and more open, more and more audacious, more and more brash, and the theists, if there are enough left, to struggle, to make a fight of it. Otherwise it will be a mere enslavement. The atheistic humanists, the scientific humanists, the secular humanists, have doctrines and literature and councils in the sense they are in a way mimicking churches, and they'll even supply a preacher, by the way, if you want to get married. It's an ethical culture preacher. So anyone who buys their philosophy and still feels he'd like a ceremony when he ties the knot with sis or whoever can hire a minister of ethical culture, and you can get buried from their study halls. They don't have churches, they have lecture halls. Learning is their great God. Now, their documents are the only documents you really have to know for a thumbnail sketch of the movement would be these two, Humanist Manifesto 1 and Humanist Manifesto 2. Manifesto 1 came out in 1933, which isn't all that far back. Now, I was born then, so it couldn't be that far back. 1933. The most famous signer of Manifesto 1 was John Dewey. Now, very few people know what Dewey held. Most people say, well, he botched up education. That's about all they know about John Dewey. And as a matter of fact, I think the only decent thing about Dewey might have been some of his experimental schools in education. In other words, that to me is his saving grace. He botched up everything else much worse. But that's all relative. I'm not even that enchanted with his theories of education. But Dewey is primarily an epistemologist. He called himself an instrumentalist, and this is strictly a doctrine of the logic of science, as I will show you in very clear cases. It's not at all mystifying. Thank God when you read John Dewey or William James or the plain old-fashioned Americans, there's nothing Germanic about them. Dewey claims he was at one time a Hegelian, and that shows up in certain stylistic complexities, but in general he's a plain-talking Yankee who just has no use for religion, God, the supernatural, absolute truth, the whole bit. And he does all this not as a crusading preacher. You see, that's the secret of these people's success. They really are a rival religion, as I think I can clearly demonstrate, but they put themselves forward as the rational answer to your pietistic dreamers. So they think that the world is composed of Bible-pounding Baptists and Lutherans and Catholics who keep trying to find out what God has said. And you know they'll never get to the end of that endless dispute. And the world is composed of those people and us, the sober, rational, scientific investigators, not prejudiced. We'll investigate God the way we investigate cancer. We're not prejudiced. And if the evidence shows that God exists, well, we'll worship this God. We're not prejudiced. But alas, the best scientific evidence in no way shows us the existence of a God. Therefore, we're going to proceed courageously in our atheism. And that's why they're winning. Their name is attractive. They've got the semantic gem of the ages to be called humanists. It's got everything in its favor. They're in favor of man. They say yes to man instead of always minimizing man at the expense of this strange God who's always demanding stupid sacrifices and unnecessary heroics and the like. And they are scientific. They don't ask you to believe, to make an act of faith. They simply have the apparatus, the logical apparatus, to discover where the truth lies, whether in chemistry or in medicine or in religion or in ethics. So one ought never to accuse Dewey of simply being a brash atheist who sweeps away the notion of God with a faith of his own. In the sense that is a valid accusation. But Dewey thinks he sweeps away the notion of God with scientific method. And that's why we have to know something about the philosophy of science, really, to deal with these people. Now, humanism is one thing in 1933 when this small group, relatively small group, mostly professors, many of them professors of philosophy, when they got together and produced Manifesto 1, they were not all that powerful in 1933. And they drew up a manifesto, and so have a million other groups. Every time you get 10 people together in a neighborhood, they have a manifesto. But some manifestos stick, get implemented, get translated into legislation, money, power. Some are simply lost in the mimeograph waste paper basket. And the Communist Manifesto has stuck. Boy, has it stuck. It's choking the world. But that's over 100 years old. Humanist Manifesto 1 has also stuck. Little by little, it has dominated, it has caught the allegiance of influential professors. It's mostly academic, but certain members of the entertainment field and the professional field, above all the lawyers, such as those who would join the American Civil Liberties Union, they are atheistic humanists who gladly espouse Manifesto 1. However, in 1973, which is a very short time ago, they updated Manifesto 1. They had their own Vatican II, although I don't know where their little conference was held. And they issued Humanist Manifesto 2. It was a kind of crowing document, very slender, unlike us Catholics and us theologians and everyone else who can say anything simply. They say everything they want to say in a pamphlet. They don't need tomes and subdistinctions and all that. They just put it in the pamphlet. I have here an issue of their monthly magazine. It's called The Humanist. It's edited by one Paul Kurtz, who's a professor of philosophy in New York at Buffalo. And I happen to have met Kurtz and debated him on television, and I'll mention that a bit later. But this is just a monthly magazine, something like Commonweal or America or National Review. It's got a few articles in it. And they simply put their Manifesto 2 in the pages of this, and then they printed it as off-prints. And we might have a few copies here. I think Gabrielle said she might bring up some copies. But if not, that's about the best money you could ever spend on literature. They want $1.50 for a few sheets. They're good businessmen too. But get a hold of their little booklet called Manifesto 1 and 2. You might even get it free at certain rallies, because then you don't have to worry any longer. Then you'll see the source of the textbooks, the curriculum, the whole orientation, say, of the government schools. No secret whatsoever. And you'll see why Junior comes home with this and this and this outrageous thing about God, religion, morality, or the like. Now, as I say, this absolutely dominates the public school system. Starting at the graduate schools, that's how it all starts. Everything starts from the top and filters down, and the schools of education and then the like. But the Catholics, wanting to be updated, opening up to the world, looking for worldly wisdom. After all, we only have Jesus Christ and the saints and the theologians like Augustine and Aquinas, and now we can really get sophisticated by learning from the likes of John Dewey and Paul Kurtz and the like. So the best thing any parent can do is to invest in this slim little document, Manifesto 1 and 2, and then you'll see for yourself that they've said it, they mean it, they're getting away with it. And meanwhile, you and I might pick at the Board of Ed about this textbook, which is, the real poison is much more advanced than you believe. So I want to read several paragraphs from the manifesto just to show you what they're saying. This is from the preface to their second manifesto. As in 1933, so now, we humanists still believe that traditional theism, and the word theism refers to belief in a personal God. They will allow you belief in some absolute. That's harmless. As C.S. Lewis says in the book Miracles, if your God is some white domed radiance, which is the genius of evolution, fine. It's nice to have some icon in your house or something. That's okay. But as in 33, so now, humanists still believe that traditional theism, especially faith in the prayer-hearing God, who is assumed to love and care for persons, to hear and understand their prayers, and to be able to do something about them, is an unproved and outmoded faith. We believe, however, that traditional dogmatic or authoritarian religions that place God, revelation, ritual, or creed above human needs and experiences do a disservice to the human species. Any account of nature should pass the tests of scientific evidence. In our judgment, the dogmas and myths of traditional religions, Judaic Christian religions, do not do so. Even at this late date in human history, they're getting a bit impatient with us theists. Haven't we read Humanist Manifesto 1? Haven't we read all the treatises of the atheists? So they're getting a bit impatient with our intransigence. Even at this late date in human history, certain elementary facts based upon the critical use of scientific reason have to be restated. We find insufficient evidence for belief in the existence of the supernatural. So they've had their elaborate investigation, and the evidence is nil. It is either meaningless or irrelevant to the question of the survival and the fulfillment of the human race. As non-theists, and if we get a little Greek about it, as atheists, since that A is equal to none, so as atheists, we begin with humans, not God, with nature, not deity. Nature may indeed be broader and deeper than we now know. They're quite humble and reverent in the face of the unexplored regions of being. They are not arrogant people. But as I'll show you, this is their salvation. This is how they really have a religion, but they pretend it to be a science, because they will hide things in this concept of nature. Nature may indeed be broader and deeper than we now know. Any new discoveries, however, will but enlarge our knowledge of the natural. Therefore, Dewey is called a naturalist. Please don't think that therefore that means he wants to save the redwoods of Oregon. When you say Dewey is a naturalist, he means he's an anti-supernaturalist. That's the meaning of naturalism in American philosophy and education. Now, here is a beautiful summary. This might go down in history with Karl Marx's "You have nothing to lose but your chains." Too often, traditional faiths encourage dependence rather than independence, obedience rather than affirmation, fear rather than courage. But we can discover no divine purpose or providence for the human species. While there is much that we do not know, humans are responsible for what we are or will become. And here is their famous ending: no deity will save us. We must save ourselves. I mean, you can't put it any clearer. If words mean anything, therefore, don't wait for the Redeemer, Israel. That's a stupid wait. And you Christians who think you have the Redeemer, wake up. If there's war, poverty, sickness, ignorance, all the miseries of human life, no deity will save us. We've got to save ourselves with courage, serenity, confidence. That is the humanist battle cry. I want to read another paragraph in their area of ethics, just to give a bit of a balance to their presentation. They're very interested in ethics and aesthetics, by the way. Unlike certain scientific people who are simply interested in cosmology and chemistry and all that, these people pride themselves that still using a scientific mentality, they can give a reasonable account of morality and, above all, art. And Dewey made a great to-do about this, because that really was his source of happiness and depth and mystery and the like. They say about ethics, and I'm only speaking about the area of sexuality, which is where a lot of the action is, but there'll be also certain other things. In the area of sexuality, we believe that intolerant attitudes, often cultivated by orthodox religions and puritanical cultures, unduly repress sexual conduct. The right to birth control, abortion, and divorce should be recognized, obviously. The individual must experience a full range of civil liberties in all societies. And here is their glorious hope for the human race. This is their splendid ideal, which they now propose to legislatures and proselytes who might want to become atheistic humanists. These civil rights include a recognition of an individual's right to die with dignity, euthanasia, and the right to suicide. That's a really courageous doctrine. I mean, this is the level, this is the typical level of atheistic humanism. They go around with such earnestness pleading for these wonderful civil rights to suicide, abortion, contraception, and death with dignity. That is their goal. Now, it should make us Christians thankful that even if we're wrong, God forbid, but I mean, if you ever want to just see what religion means, at least we have some noble ideals. You know, I would quit. If this were the real goal of my life, I'd go fishing. But this is their whole hope, to instill in the legislatures of the world this courageous doctrine that I've just enunciated. Now I want to make the contrast. The chief area of dispute, as I said before, will probably be in my own lifetime on battlefields and in concentration camps, but right now it's still in the universities, in the pulpits, in the press, in the educational system. It is this clash between fundamentally opposed doctrines or beliefs. And I will sum them up or name them as God-centered humanism. I refuse to allow the atheist to grab that word humanism as if only atheists give a darn about man. I insist that if we know what it's all about, we'll find out that it's the religious people, but above all the Catholic Christians, who are the only real humanists. They really care about the individual person, not about some abstraction, humanity. But my warfare then, or the dispute will be between the biblical humanists, the God-centered humanists, above all the Christian Catholic humanists on the one hand, and the secular humanists on the other, who put their faith in science, reason, and the like, but I claim it is a faith, in no way a scientific position. What does biblical humanism say? I don't really have to stress it to a group like this, but let's at least summarize it. Biblical humanism begins with a personal God. Crucial point here, it is not enough to say there's an absolute, some sort of supreme being. It's not even enough to say that the absolute is a mind, because a lot of people are quite comfortable so long as the mind doesn't move too much, or so long as it's only knowing itself, the way Aristotle's mind knows itself. We Christians, we biblical people, including the Jews, say that if there's anything in experience which is close to God, we admit God is inscrutable, incomprehensible, beyond any concept, but if you asked us what is there in experience which most closely approximates deity, we say person. And what you mean by a person is an awakened being, a being who understands, who wills, a being who has the power to rejoice and to love. And we say, therefore, in the Bible, a personal God made everything. That's our first principle. We say that He has His unchanging holy will concerning our actions, that God is not indifferent to the behavior of the creatures, the personal creatures He has made. The non-personal creatures go because they are impelled to go by their God-given natures. We personal creatures are invited and obliged, but not compelled, to do good and avoid evil. So God has His unholy, His unchanging holy will concerning our actions, and these are stated at least as a minimum in the Ten Commandments. In any real ecumenism, the moral minimum is the Ten Commandments. If you deny any of these commandments, you are simply out of the theistic court already. We also say that the biblical view says that God is such that we ought to worship Him, to praise Him, to pray to Him, to honor His name. That this is the whole meaning of religion, that there is a personal God most worthy of our adoration, praise, and love. Also, this personal God is such that He hears petitions, prayers, not some clay idol, not some deaf absolute, infinitely remote from human concern, but we know from the Bible, the Old and above all the New Testament, that God wants us to pray, commands us to pray of praise, prayers of praise and adoration and thanksgiving, but also of petition. Ask the Heavenly Father, and He will give this to you, so that in our needs, in our everyday needs, in our extraordinary needs, we do have prayers of petition, and we say that He hears prayers made in faith, and He answers them. That's absolutely not negotiable. So far as personal religion goes, as theistic religion goes, it's not negotiable. We also say that this life on earth is not the end-all and be-all of our existence. That is crucial. We believe that we are immortal. Heaven and earth will pass away. Societies will pass away. Universities will pass away. Communism, socialism, America, France, Canada will pass away. The stars will pass away. We will not pass away. Never, never, never. We are immortal. Therefore, our period of existence on this earth is a fraction. It's not even, mathematically speaking, it really has no measure. In contrast with the endless eternity that awaits each one of us. Now, when you take that seriously, and one wonders how often we do, everything is different. Trials, sufferings, crosses, the frustrations of daily life, the sickness, the hopes, the smashed hopes. All of these things are different because we who believe in God believe in an afterlife, and we say that our days on earth are not meant necessarily for happiness. It's nice when you get a happy day. Praise God. Thank God. It's beautiful when life turns out right in marriage, in children, in health, in education and the like. But that's not the nature, that's not the meaning of this life. The deepest meaning of life on earth, and this, by the way, was already understood by Socrates, who had no revelation, but he had such an enormous sense for God and eternity that he too understood this, because the moral data gave him a hint. The deepest meaning of life on earth is it is a moral trial. It is a period of moral trial. We are here, we are given this fairy land of the earth with its good climates and its bad. We are given fellow humans, some good, some bad. We are given learning, we are given so many things, but the main thing is that we be good. However the climate, whatever our education, whatever situation we're placed in life, the meaning of life, what makes sense to the entire drama of life, is this challenge which situations will offer us to be good, morally good, and to avoid evil. Therefore, we say there is an afterlife, and the entire destiny of our afterlife will depend on these short years we have spent in the antechamber of earthly life. And right now they seem endless, especially if you're an 8th grader. When I was in the 8th grade, I felt old. It seemed as if school would never end and life would never end. And right now things are a bit quicker for me. But most people, especially if they suffer, think that life drags on endlessly. And yet if eternity is real, immortality is real, God is real, judgment is real, how little it all means. As St. Paul says, I reckon that the sufferings of this world are not worthy to be compared to the glory of the life to come. So this is an immense fact in biblical humanism, that in our zealous concern for our brother, in our concern for man, we see this entire life against the background of eternity. Our brother is not simply made for dental care and for cradle-to-grave security, as desirable as this might be. Our brother is destined for eternity. And so are we. And that puts things in perspective. Now, secular humanism, if you say, well, what does secular humanism hold? Very simply. Just take every statement I've made about biblical humanism and contradict it. No God, no afterlife, no absolute morality, etc., etc. They are the mirror opposite of biblical humanism, of God-centered humanism. They simply deny every one of the statements. That's why any of us who are worried about certain education, even in allegedly religious schools, we are alarmed because everything our children learn contradicts what we learn. Sure. Because we learn a religious humanism, our children are learning an atheistic humanism. Now, but just note this about atheistic humanism. It is humanism, the man is central. It ousts God, and it puts man in these two positions. It has these two positions for man. In the first place, man is the highest product of evolution. Oh, that is a faith. They don't go near that faith. They believe in evolution more than the Baptists believe in the Bible. And if you ever challenge their faith in evolution, they panic. But right now, so far as we know, that this blind matter, after billions of mistrials and strange chances, blind matter has cast up us conscious people called humans on planet Earth, and we are obviously the highest product of evolution, but we might go higher. Therefore, we'll get Teilhard de Chardin and other fiction writers to visualize or imagine how the next quantum leap is going to be in this ever onward motion of evolutionary forces. So that's the first thing. We are the product of blind chance, no meaning, no rationality, just matter endlessly playing with itself without rhyme or reason, created us or congealed into us. Now, Plato already knew this doctrine. This doctrine was already rampant in the days of Athens. Plato brilliantly discusses it. And the second point is, man is the ultimate determiner of good and evil. You and I want to know, should we do this? Should we not do that? Very important. They don't want you to just to be a libertine, doing anything permissively. But you and I are priest-ridden. If we want to know, should we do this or should we do that, we go to the parson or the rabbi or the good book. And then God tells us to do this or do that. Not so the humanists. There is no God. Only cosmic forces in space. So they say, we men, just as we decide whether you go on the left side of the street or the right side of the street driving, I hope you don't consult the Bible for traffic regulation. So we men, if we want abortion, if we figure out that abortion is good, well, abortion is good. And that is precisely the mentality beyond this unbelievable Supreme Court we have. And it's about 100 years old that we've already had a Chief Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who insisted on that anything is evil if the state says it is evil. So we men are the ones who determine what is good and what is evil. They don't mean we are the ones who ascertain what is good and what is evil. I would agree with that. That it is up to us to find out what is good and evil. They say it is we who make something to be good or evil by our will. Typical majority in a legislature or Supreme Court or whatever. They have no room for worship, prayer, or absolute morality, as I noted from that. As a matter of fact, they don't even have any meaning to these things. It's one thing if you say, God exists. I'm arguing with someone and I say God exists and morality is absolute, and he says, no, I don't think God exists. Well, I understand that. But the humanists say, Marra, we don't even know what you mean when you say God exists. It's a scientifically meaningless statement. So too the statement that morality is absolute. That's scientifically meaningless for them. Now the irony is this, that in the schools controlled by the government, the state schools, which are most of them, the Catholics had a viable alternative, but we're tripping over ourselves to get rid of it. But in the schools controlled by the government, no one is allowed to teach theism as true. That if I walk into any public school, at least the high school down under, in college you're theoretically able to teach theism as true, but don't try it. It's a very dangerous occupation to walk on a secular campus and teach that God exists. It's even dangerous to do that on a Catholic campus, but it's still more dangerous on a secular campus. But at least on a college campus, they leave you alone a little bit more because everything's so wild on the typical college campus, they don't even know what you're saying. But it's in the high schools and the grade schools that I'm talking about now. Nobody is constitutionally able to stand up before the children and say, you know, children, a God made you. God made you. A personal God made you. He loves you. He has revealed His Word to you. He wants you to be good. No, 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 no. That the humanists shriek. And the Supreme Court shrieks. They said, no, no, we're sorry that maybe God exists. We're not going to interfere with your personal piety. But please, in our schools, because of this unfortunate controversy among religious people and so on, we cannot allow mere piety, mere supernatural opinions, faith, to enter into our curriculum. So we're going to teach the children sound, rational subjects, chemistry, religion, economics, social science. That's very sound and rational, and so on. That's allowed, but if you want your pietistic saying, have Sunday school, we're not going to stop you. It's a free country, and so on. So that's the way it is. And here's the trouble, though. You know, you wouldn't even mind it. I even understand them. Given that we're killing each other over religion, which, as Chesterton says, is at least something worthwhile to kill each other over, I could even see how the government would say, look, plague on everybody's house. I mean, we can satisfy Jews, Protestants, atheists, and everybody, so don't even mention God or religion. All right, I could see that. And if they really stuck to real arithmetic, real history, and so on, it would be a very truncated education. Not something I'd want for my children, but it would be tolerable. If the public schools would really stick to academic subjects and no ideological bias, if that's abstractly possible, it's concretely impossible, I could tolerate it, right? But they're not satisfied with that. Under the guise of science, here's what they do. They say, you see, they don't stick to arithmetic. They have all kinds of classes with social problems. And this is the typical way it happens. They'll say, now class, they don't say this to the class, they say this to us who had been trying to get into the public school system to teach about God and morality. They say, I'm sorry, you Baptist or you Catholic or Jew, we cannot allow you to teach your religion because there is no scientific evidence that a personal God exists, that there's life after death, or that there are absolutes in morality. No scientific evidence. And for a moment I might say, well, gee, I guess they're right, yeah. And then they say, we're sorry, well, you put up your Sunday school here. Then they close the door on me and they've got the children, anywhere from kindergarten through senior year high, and then they're going to talk about all kinds of problems. How the world began, what we should do with overpopulation, what we should do if retarded children are born to a family, and they're not going to preach. Everything's rational, scientific, and all that. They're going to even let the children, by discussion, come to an understanding of the principle. So, do you see what's happening? That they will put this is happening all the time. I am in no way exaggerating or caricaturing. They're going to build up, now children, suppose there's this family, and they have 2 or 3 beautiful children, and the mother was exposed to thalidomide, and she's expecting a baby now, and the doctors say the baby will be terribly deformed and mentally retarded. What do you think we should do? Susan? George? And so on. And they have this wonderful objective discussion. We're not bringing in Bibles or opinion. And they all see how unjust it is to the child to bring him into the world and so on. So then someone might get the idea, well, I guess abortion would be the right solution. Yes, that's a very interesting point, Susan. I guess it would be. It would probably be fairer to snuff out the life of the child than to carry it to term and so on. But then some other bright person says, but wouldn't it even be better if we had contraception? Oh, gee, that's interesting, isn't it? Then we wouldn't even have the mess of an abortion. So it's situations like this. You see, they're not prejudiced. They're not on a pulpit preaching religion. But because scientifically, God, morality, life after death, which might make some sense out of a retarded child born into your house, because these things are excluded as scientifically inadmissible, well, we're going to solve population problems, retardation problems, senility problems, anything with atheistic solutions. They are atheistic solutions, all of these other things. And, of course, the beginning of the world. That why is it we're so sure evolution is true? Do we have any empirical evidence that evolution is true? Have we ever considered the impossibility of the scientific chance involved that evolution be true? Well, they admit all this. They say, we know it's a... On the basis we would reject it, but the only alternative is theism, and we know that's not true. Therefore, evolution is true. So, because they have rejected theism from the start, not with any scientific reasoning, as I'll show you, evolution fills the vacuum. So Junior insists, take it for granted, perfectly obvious that evolution is true, that there is no life after death, no God, no absolute, and they're learning all of these wonderful, humane solutions to the world. Now, what I want to do in the time that remains is to show you that these humanists are swindlers. They are not perhaps conscious swindlers, but what they really have is a philosophy that excludes God no matter what. They have an airtight system which could not admit God no matter what the evidence, but they phrase it in such a way that it sounds as if they're objective and open, and that by Jiminy, if the evidence went the other way, well, they'd start praying. I want to show you how this works with this problem of the knowledge of the existence of God. By the way, there are several interesting humanists. I think the doctrine is hellish, and I think it's absolutely destroying the country and the churches, but the individual humanists are not always that bad. For example, there's this interesting psychologist, Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-Z, who's got all kinds of other problems, but he's a refreshing breath of air when it comes to talking about the swindle of psychological science. He's a professor in Syracuse. You have also one of the Soviet dissenters, not Solzhenitsyn, who's a much greater man, but what's this other Soviet? I can't think of his name, but he's a physicist. Sakharov. He's a signer of human. And relative to Russia, this is heaven. I mean, if you compare the Soviet hell with the humanist utopia, the humanists win. They're a much nicer crowd than the Kremlin. So you have a lot of people like Sakharov and Szasz and so on who are personally nice people, even though the doctrine is most unfortunate. And you also have Steve Allen, who's a nice guy. I don't know him that much, but from what I see him on TV, he's a likable guy. I can really sympathize with him. He's an ex-Catholic, and it seems to me if he could be rescued from this mesmerism of Dewey's epistemology, he would be happy. He's not happy that God doesn't exist, but he thinks the evidence points that way. So I want to show you what happens. I just would take three different statements, and then I'll concentrate only on the one statement that God exists. I have three different statements. One is God exists. The other is that Christ is God. And the other is that murder is evil. So, God exists, Christ is God, murder is evil. My question is, how can you know whether these statements are either true or false? I don't care which. I just want to know, what are the ways of knowing these statements to be true or false? Now, briefly, there are only three ways to know anything. There might be sub-distinctions, but the three clear ways to know anything are as follows. One way is the easiest way, namely through an observable happening that anyone can grasp, that which is the grand highway of all science. Every empirical science can only use this way. For example, I want to know whether this substance is poisonous or not. We call it arsenic, but we could call it helium. I could call it coffee. It doesn't make any difference. But I pick up this substance and I say, is this substance lethal? It smells good. It might look good. Is it lethal? The only possible way I can know that is to try it out. Give it to people or to guinea pigs or whatever. That's the only way we know whether medicines work. That's the only way we know whether water will break up into H2O or H2O2 or whatever, is to do it. See, and by the way, that's the heart of Dewey's instrumentalism. That's exactly what he means by instrumentalism, that if you want to know anything, do something. Put electrodes in the water, feed your dog arsenic or vitamin B or whatever, right? So that's one way, and an enormous part of our knowledge comes from our grasping observable happenings in time. And anybody, if you have eyes and ears, you can join the club. You don't have to be a genius to know that your dog died or this hamster got fatter when you fed it vitamin E and so on. Anybody can do it. You might have to be a genius setting up the experiment, but once it's set up, any clerk can know it and does know it. That's the first way. But there's a second way of knowing something which we all do. And the humanists will admit it partially, but not always. The second way is what I call through understanding or through insight. How do you know that there is no whole number which is the square root of 2? That there is no integer which is the square root of 2? That there's no number which when you multiply by itself will give you 2? Well, there's no experiment to do that, but you understand it. All of arithmetic is non-experimental. It's stupid to say we perform laboratory experiments and we've been trying to find the square root of 2 in this laboratory and we're getting more federal aid and maybe we will, and all that. No, I'm sorry, friend. The entire drama of math takes place right up here. And the same is true with ethics, symbolic logic, real logic, philosophy, disputes about whether socialism is better than communism and so on. All of these problems are answerable, if at all. I'm not saying the answer is easy or even possible, but if the answer is given, it will not be through observable events in time and space. It will be through insight, understanding. You and I will see that certain numbers have no square roots, other numbers have square roots. And I say, you and I will see that murder is evil. Now, there's a third way of knowing something, and that is through faith. That many of us, besides those other two ways, we are convinced that Christ is God, that there is an afterlife, and so on, through faith. We do not claim this is observable in experience. There's no experiment proving that. Neither do we claim that it's an insight in the same sense as arithmetic is or philosophy is. It's precisely neither of these two things. As St. Paul says, faith is the evidence of the things that don't appear. You need some new principle to know that Christ is God, or that there are three persons in the Trinity, or in a certain way that there's an afterlife. I think philosophy could adumbrate it, but I think Revelation fixes it. Now, the problem is this. The scientific atheistic humanists say the only valid knowledge is the first kind of knowledge, through observation and mathematics. They have to allow that math is valid, although they're very uncomfortable with the nature of math. It's very amusing to see how they squirm, because they'd love to reduce math to experiments. Dewey did. And Bertrand Russell, who is otherwise so deplorable, is delicious as he ridicules Dewey for his stupid understanding of math. But Dewey said arithmetic is as empirical as metallurgy. That's one of his priceless sayings in epistemology. But so they will admit that, well, there are possible truths to be gotten by thinking about numbers. They reluctantly admit that. They'd better, because their precious science wouldn't be any more advanced than the Dark Ages if they didn't have math. And, of course, the first method of knowing is valid, namely all of these empirical observations and experiments and the like. But they absolutely refuse any validity to philosophical insight and, above all, faith. But here's the trouble. Their entire belief that only scientific observation is valid is itself not a matter of scientific observation. And I therefore ask the following questions. The most basic question would be this. Given that you're a scientific humanist, you dismiss faith, you dismiss philosophy in the name of science, would you please tell me what experiment you use, scientific experiment, in the same way that we use arsenic on this group and some candy on the control group. Tell me what scientific experiment you use to prove that only scientific knowledge is valid. That's a very embarrassing question. And you're going to find out these people have a faith or a philosophy which itself is not capable of scientific proof, but it may be capable of insight proof or whatever, which says that only scientific knowledge is possible. So that's the first question I put to the humanists. The second question concerned those other ones. That God exists or does not exist is ultimately a question of insight or faith. There is no scientific experiment in the world which, if it went this way, proves God exists, and if it goes that way, proves God does not exist. It simply can't happen. So too with ethics. Would you please tell me how you know I claim to know abortion is evil? They claim to know that it's wonderful, but they do say that lying is evil and bugging other people's rooms are evil. They all know that poor Richard Nixon was a pariah, a moral leper. And how do they know that? Tell me what scientific statement do you use, what scientific apparatus do you use to verify the statement bugging is evil or abortion is good? And you know what the answer is? There is no scientific apparatus that either you see it, you grasp it with arguments, insight, dialectic in the philosophical sense, or you don't, or you hold it on faith. Now here's what they're doing though. They have this swindle. They act as if, if you could show a scientific proof that God exists, we'd change our mind. We're open-minded about it. So here's what Steve Allen proposed. I read this in a popular magazine, but I'm absolutely certain it's still his thought, and I know it's the thought of the atheistic humanist. He said, why can't we have a scientific proof of God's existence? Because some reporter said, Steve, what would it take to make you a believer? You're a nice guy, you care about your fellow man, you like the local rabbi and priest, you're not personally bitter. What would it take to make you a scientific believer, to make you a believer in a prayer-hearing God? And you know what Allen said? He said, well, let's set up an experiment. He never did this, but this is the way he would want the experiment to be set up. Let's pick a hospital. Let's say Bronx Hospital in New York. And we're not going to tell anybody in the hospital about this experiment because then we have the added input of suggestion, auto-suggestion and the like. But let's get a group of contemplative nuns to pray for the people on the right hand of the ward. Right? It's all terminal cases. You got people who, the MDs have got them photographed and they're all filled with malignant tumors and they have within 1 or 6 months to live, right? So you have all this ward, 50 people. Let's get the nuns to plead before God for the right hand of the ward, right? Because if there's a prayer-hearing God now, He's going to hear it. And as a control group, we won't have anybody praying for the left hand, right? Now, isn't that scientific? Now, if at the end of 6 months the right-hand side survives, or even mostly survives, that they're not interested in 100% perfection, but if at least the majority statistically survived, whereas all the control group died, that would make it probable that God exists, right? And that's the kind of, and Allen says, well, if that kind of experiment took place, we would believe in God. I mean, that's scientific evidence. That's how come we believe that arsenic is lethal and vitamin E is good, with control groups and with doing something to the environment. And in a certain way, some people think that this is a great idea As a matter of fact, there are two interesting footnotes to this alleged experiment of Steve Allen. In the Old Testament, Elijah actually pulled that experiment off. And a lot of people, let me quickly sum that up and then I'll get to the modern version. The Old Testament went something like this. Elijah said, I have the true God. And the other people said, no, Baal is the true God. And normally they would fight. Have a good religious war. But some instrumentalists, some humanists, some pragmatists at the idea, let's put it to an experiential test. I think this was Elijah. He was a Deweyite before his time. And the test was simply this: you put your offering there and pray like mad to your God. I'll put my offering here and pray like mad to my God. And whoever offering catches fire, that's empirical proof. Now, we won that one. In the Old Testament, and Steve Allen's point would be this: it really was dramatic in those days, that because the poor priests of Baal kept praying like mad, and they whipped themselves up into a frenzy, and Elijah was even taunting them, whereas Elijah even soaked his altar to rub it in, and like that, it was on fire, right? So Steve Allen says, if that kind of thing happened today, we'd buy religion, right? That's their point. I'm going to show you it's not their point. They're wrong. It's a swindle, even though they don't know it. But there was something still simpler than that in the 20th century with this man Ingersoll. He had the perfect proof that God didn't exist, the scientific proof that God didn't exist, and all he needed was the second hand on his watch. And it went something like this: God, if there is a God, I beg you to strike me down for my impiety and blasphemy within the next 60 seconds. And 60 seconds, he's still there. God doesn't exist. But surely any God with a little pride would have cut him down. You see, now this is the kind of stuff that sounds silly and all that, but that's what they call scientific proof about a thesis. I simply note they have no such scientific proof about their own thesis, namely that only science is true. That's my first point. But let me get to the later part of the swindle. Suppose it did happen. Suppose that the nuns prayed for the right side of Ward A and it got cured. This is, I want to show you that they cannot possibly be satisfied. So we have Bronx Hospital, right hand, left hand. The nuns pray for the right hand, and what do you know? They're cured. The left hand dies. Now, this happens, we have two alternatives. Either it happened only once, and all the other times the nun prays didn't do any good, or it happens all the time. Right? That would be the two extremes. Now, in the Bronx Hospital, it happened only once. And we say, well, Steve Allen, we did it. We got those good Carmelites to pray. Everybody on the right-hand side was cured. Everybody on the left-hand side was not cured. Therefore, God exists. Therefore, there is a prayer-hearing God. We prayed to him, he got action. Right? And they say, well, that makes the thesis more probable. You have so far verified it, but now let's try it in Portland General Hospital. Let's try it in Africa. Let's try it in Moscow, because it might have been some accidental feature of the environment. After all, we scientists are objective. So we try it in Portland, we try it in Alaska, we try it here, doesn't work. They say, well, therefore, obviously, there is no God. That it was a freak. We can't explain it, but we scientists never claim to be omniscient. It was simply one of those things, these instantaneous, spontaneous remissions. Maybe we'll never get the explanation, or maybe when we have more sensitive instruments, we'll find out that in just this hospital, on just that day, there was a cosmic storm, and it only hit the right-hand side of the ward. That's possible. But suppose it always happens. Suppose every time nuns or anybody, we'd have to set up a careful experiment on this, every time they opened their mouth and prayed for this ward or that ward, it was always cured, always cured. Would that convince these people that there's a God? No. Because in that case, then, it would belong to the nature of things that the people are cured. You know, this is what happens, that when you have a drug, If you have if I have a lot of sick people, and I administer drug X, and it works only once, and it never works again, well, it was a freak. The one time it worked was a freak, right? If I administer drug Y, and it always works, well, that's not due to God or the supernatural. It means it's the nature of Y to oppose this germ. Penicillin opposes all of these germs, right? So too, if something happens only once, it's chance. If it happens all the time, it's nature. Now, I admit it's pretty far-fetched that nature, it'd be pretty far-fetched to give an exact explanation of how voices of little nuns who are praying in the dark, say, could be linked to the cure, but their point is nature may be bigger than we know, but all we know is this: there is no supernature. Now that, friends, is not science at all. It's neither good science nor bad science. It's philosophy. They have no scientific evidence that, even in other words, if the evidence changed, they have a ready answer in philosophy so that God can't win. There's not a possible way God could show up in their philosophy, because whether things are cured or not cured, if they're cured once and never again, it's a freak. It's one of these accidents. If they're cured all the time, it's nature that gets the credit. Now, I'll show you how this really happens in a much more serious case. If ever any of us thinks of a human person, incredible reality, that when I think of my own self, I see that I am wonderfully made in the sense of what a prodigy consciousness is, and this ability to know and to love and so on. And then when I realize that I am the product of two other persons on this earth, in my reverence, I assign it to God. I think only God makes a human person. But the humanists say, because it happens all the time, nature. And a happy event, it's a beautiful baby. Nature made the baby. So there's much more to humanism than I've said, but I'd briefly like to sum up things and then conclude that the summary is this: these people act as if they have a profound principle of knowledge which will get rid of nonsense and quarrels. That is the dream of all philosophy, once and for all, to end the useless disputes among men. Can't we work together instead of having wars and factions and the like? Their dream is scientific knowledge. That just as we solve whether arsenic is good or vitamin D is good by experiment, so let us solve whether there's an afterlife or whether Christ is God or whether God exists by experiment. Since no matter which way the experiment turns out, they won't change their mind. And since there are no experiments really which can prove that something is good and something is evil, these people reject from the start the supernatural, absolute in morality, a life after death. And then, in the name of a science which they have no title to, having excluded religion and the afterlife and morality, they now solve all problems of war, population, education, retardation of children with their own atheistic setup. And these are the fruits, really, of secular humanism. I want one final footnote, though, here, that when I was in Buffalo several years ago, it was about 6 months after this Manifesto 2 was published, Jim Lakutis of CUF told me that he had arranged a TV debate between Paul Kurtz and myself. Kurtz had a half-hour show called The Humanist Alternative. I love the way these people act as if they are just the way the progressives in the Catholic Church act. The progressives act as if they're the outsiders, they're the rebels, they have no power, and we conservatives have all the money and the power. So too, Kurtz acts as if the entire establishment is against him. He's a mere alternative. The humanist alternative. Chief folks, why don't you look at us? Really, he controls about 50 million, the movement controls about 50 million students in the schools. But when I had read the manifesto, when I had studied Dewey and all that, I was really prepared to hate him. Because, the only person that hates worse than a philosopher is a theologian, but there's no love in theology or philosophy. So his philosophy seemed to me so wretched, so pathetic and so on. I was snarling, really, going to the theater, to the studio, and when I met the man, I instantly changed my mind that it seemed to me he was pathetic. That here's this person, he's proposing a gigantic new movement, he's issuing a manifesto to change the world, and he had these pathetic little dreams. And I'd like to just close on a meditation on that very briefly, that the manifesto, as I say, is very arrogant, and the secular humanists are very arrogant, but what a wretched ideal they cherish. That in a certain way you can see this could never enlist the allegiance and loyalty of people for very long. Once the euphoria of science pops, once the epistemologists and the creationists show that their pretensions to science are illusion, I think that the movement hopefully will collapse because of the wretched ideals they cherish. That here are people who it takes so little to satisfy them. They have no desire. St. Francis de Sales said, we should be Daniels of desire. We should desire infinite things. But these humanists are so modest in everything. What they want is what the British Labour Party gives the world. I mean, something like that. It's a modest, wretched little existence for 60 years or so, and in the name of this thing, they think they can lead the human race to a utopia. So you should just think they want food and shelter, air conditioning, a little love, art, things like that, peace, and then they are satisfied with an endless sleep. This really is this. They are in no way terrified by death. It's one of the inevitabilities of time. They are in no way in awe of birth. It's one of the ways nature coughs up new individuals. And for these people, there is never an ethical drama. See, the entire meaning of literature is destroyed. They would say it's much better that way. Who needs drama? If we can have peace and dental care and air conditioning. But there are no vows, no bearing crosses patiently, no God who made us, who enlightens us, or who will judge us. So if they have a retarded child, they kill it. But there is no drama in their life. And these people, I would ask you therefore to note this. On the one hand, they pose an ominous threat to us. But it's strictly our fault. If we were a vigorous people of God, if we had faith, if we acted on the vision which faith alone could give, we would have it would be such an attractive lifestyle that we could gather up momentum in the world. But because we're suckling our wounds and moaning and spending so much fruitless discussion on inanities and so on, that we are allowing them to survive and to prosper. So on the one hand, they are ominous, because they're atheistic forces in the name of science, in the name of humanism, are conquering every important place in the world and threaten to swamp the church. They will not ultimately swamp us, but they might give us a good ducking. Don't kid yourself on that, and a lot of people will drown. But on the other hand, they are ultimately pathetic and pitiable, and we ought really to sympathize with their midget worldview, and we ought to see how much there is to harvest in the world. That instead of being so apologetic about biblical humanism, about the meaning of God, the implications of absolute morality, life after death, and so on, we ought to vigorously pursue them and explain them and justify our position, because what a difference, even in dimension, never mind in truth. I mean, I say we're true, but quite apart from truth, what a difference in dimension the two views have. So I think of these poor humanists, such as Kurtz and Dewey and the like, that they have these, the ultimate in their life are certain cosmic energies. They think of crackling dust storms in the distant past, and they think of some sort of swirl of matter in the future. They have only silent spaces in between, and they have this nothingness which gave them origin and a nothingness which is their destiny. And I think that in closing, there are two quotations which are appropriate here. One is from the Epistle of St. Jude. And this epistle is a good reflection on the method of the secular humanist, that the method which rejects insight and faith in the name of an alleged science, whereas their very rejection itself is a matter of faith or insight, and not science. St. Jude says, "Such men sneer at the things they cannot understand. Like the brute beasts, they derive knowledge only from their senses, and it serves to corrupt them." And finally, the prophet Jeremiah says something which could be applied to the humanists, but it seems to me it's more fittingly applied to the apostate Christians who go a-whoring after humanism, secular humanism. It's bad enough that you're a humanist, but that you were born in Russia and you never knew any better, or that you were born in a pagan atmosphere. But those Christians who have left the treasures of truth and light in the Catholic Church to go a-whoring after this humanism, I think the words of Jeremiah really apply to them, but also to the rest of them. "Know thou and see that it is a bitter and an evil thing for thee to have left the Lord thy God, and that my fear is not with thee, says the Lord God of hosts. My people have done two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and they have digged to themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water." Right. Well, it is the philosophy of it's pragmatism or instrumentalism of John Dewey, but this is the whole point, that it's not sufficient to say that the reason why we have all this atheism in the public schools is that they all go to atheistic universities. That's part of the reason. The other reason is that if we have theists teaching in the public school, and we do, they're shut up. In other words, so that we have two different problems. We have the constitutional legal problem that the version of God's truth gets no hearing in the public school system. That's a legal constitutional thing. Once, if ever that's solved, then we have your problem. How come most of the spokesmen, or many of the spokesmen in the public school, are serving us up this version of atheism? That's because when they go to state teachers college, they do amateur philosophy in their other courses, and when they study professional philosophy, it's usually pragmatism. Pragmatism is, although it's disguised today under the title of logical positivism or analytic philosophy, but that's it. No, that would be a different thing altogether. I would say these humanists would throw that out too as gibberish. They don't know what it means. And I wonder sometimes whether the existentialists know what it means. Guys like Heidegger and all that. Yes, please?
I just had a question on any kind of proof or any, you said it didn't have any scientific proof or university
of scientific proof alone, yeah. In other words, do they have a philosophy justifying the use of science? Well, I would say that the philosophy is logical positivism, probably the philosophy that in Britain the chief name was Ayer, A-Y-E-R, but all of these are versions. The school is called logical positivism, and Bertrand Russell would be one spokesman of it. And their whole point is they always talk about meaning. Meaning is that they love meaningful sentences. And they would say there are only two ways a sentence can be meaningful. Never mind true. They're not even into truth. A sentence is meaningful if it points to an observable event, however remote. So if I say there are 359 million stars, that's a meaningful statement, because in principle we can set up an apparatus to count it, right? Whereas if I say murder is good, that would as such be meaningless, because there's no way we can solve that statement. So one type of statement, therefore, that's meaningful is when you can ascertain the answer this way or that way with observation. The other type is when the answer can be obtained by deductive logic. So they will allow math to be meaningful, not because it's observable, but because they claim they can deduce it from their first principle.
So then would you have a mathematical reasoning or demonstration?
No, obviously not. You see, that's the whole trouble, that when it's at first blush, whenever a college sophomore hears logical positivism or anything like this, he's impressed. It sounds so much more intelligent than the stuff he's heard from the parson. But then, sooner or later, people say, hey, how about proving that statement, which is your privilege? How about giving us a philosophical or mathematical proof of that? And there's a lot of confusion, and then what they do is they decide that there are two kinds of languages. There's a language in which that I just used, talking about this and that. Then they claim there's a meta-language. And then they have a whole logic of which would be language to talk about the other language, and they postpone the question that way. But there is a real crisis in epistemology because of those people.
I have another question.
Sure.
You mentioned all four they support the idea of death with dignity. That the word dignity definitely being kind of a non-scientific word in that sense. Do they use that? It's obvious there's humanist choice, but do they
I know what you mean. Do they have any room in their philosophy for value language? Right? Would that be it?
have any scientific proof of this man designed with dignity and this man did not?
No, you're quite right. Now, obviously, you're quite right. There is absolutely no way you can have serious scientific proof about any of these value words, but they, therefore, are quite unrigorous and unscientific when they say that. But you know how they'll do it, though? They need to use value words. You couldn't talk for a half hour without using value words like good, important, desirable, and so on. So when it finally comes to their justifying their use of value words, there are two possible explanations. The easiest one is to take a poll. That it is impossible to say that abortion is desirable, or death with dignity is desirable. It's impossible to say that this statement can be proved true by science. But it is possible to prove scientifically that 63% of the people of Portland believe it is true. We postponed the question one point further. So what they'll say, they're never going to say death with dignity is good. They're going to say, well, we took a poll, and 63% of the whites and 67% of the Chicanos thought death with dignity is good. Now, that can be scientifically proved. You can send out your own pollsters and so on and all that. But, of course, that evades the issue completely, right? No. But secondly, no. They can't describe it. But secondly, they have this ploy. They say anytime a word is a value word, it obviously does not mean to make a statement about reality. It makes a statement about your own emotions. So when you say death with dignity is good, you really mean you like it, right? And then if you say, but what do you mean by someone likes it? Well, they send you to psychology because the psychologists have all of these studies about how organisms have positive or negative reactions to stimuli. So that's what's done in all. I don't know if you're are you a philosophy major, by the way? No, but if you go on the campuses, that's what they call philosophy now. All of this mysticism and all of this jumbling around words like truth, value, meaning, nobility, and the like, and they're winning. I mean, the average college student hasn't got time to think it through. Yes, please? Yeah, that doesn't do as much good, yeah. Well, yeah, you see, they're not consistent. That's one of the reasons that if we want to get into this whole political realm, we'll see the Supreme Court, besides being very limited, is also very inconsistent. And sometimes that's a happy thing, because if they're stupid on one thing, inconsistently they're good on another, and they are very open to pressure. The Supreme Court is in no way a real juridical body. I would say it's a kind of remote political body. So when enough people screamed for under God, they let it in. And if other people scream it down, they'll take it out. That's the way most things get done. But that's not even such a victory. Big deal. So when we do say the Pledge of Allegiance, we can say under God, big deal. That's going to compensate for all this evolution stuff and all this abortion stuff. It's nonsense. By the way, I have not read the book, but I'm pretty sure Father Hardin said, if it were scientifically proved, we could live with it. He never said it's scientifically proved, or if he did, I'm going to introduce him to some priest in the area here. Yeah. Well, Father, the whole point is this, that when evolution was having its heyday, and the theologians panicked, and some of them are still panicking, but thanks to the good Protestants, no more. But when it seemed virtually certain that there would be scientific proof of evolution, then the theologians said, well, what's going to happen if it's true? And they started saying, well, we're still going to insist that the soul of man was directly created by God, even if the body could have been proved to have evolved from lower species. But that is a big if. I'm now saying this, that I would defy anybody pushing evolution to show me the scientific evidence why he knows that anything has transformed itself due to the laws of chance, which is what evolution means. And this is not simply on my authority. I am not a scientist, but I am in touch with, first of all, the excellent group in San Diego, the Creation Research Institute. Secondly, in the area we have Father Morrison, who has an excellent talk on the mathematical nonsense of evolution. And what I do is I've talked to Nobel Prize winners now. I've lost my shyness. I used to be very apologetic because when I was a graduate student at Fordham, we were intimidated by the head of the anthropology department. He walked in, he told the graduate students, this was in Father Gustav Weigel's class, by the way, and Weigel was a good man, but I'd say uncautious. And this head of the department walked in, not Weigel, but a different person. He said, gentlemen, you might as well make up your mind. It is scientifically proved that man evolved and that evolution is true. So for 20 years I used to creep around, not saying a word about evolution, but what I do now is I don't know enough scientifically to refute it, but I do know enough to invite anybody to give me his reasons why he knows evolution is true. That's all I do. And I did this at a big symposium in New York. There was this famous biologist, René Dubois. And I simply said, sir, would you please sketch, I wasn't going to be insistent or ornery or anything, would you please sketch the evidence whereby you have verified the hypothesis of evolution? And for 20 minutes he stammered and he acted completely as if you asked a Baptist to say why he believes Jesus is Lord or the Bible is the Word of God. The poor Baptist, that's his faith. I mean, that's his faith. Once he accepts his faith, then he knows chapter and verse of everything else. Well, René Dubois simply had an absolute faith that evolution was true. But if you question the faith, he was speechless. And that's all I do. I respectfully ask anybody, mathematician, physicist, paleontologist, will you please indicate to me the empirical evidence, like arsenic and control group, the whole bit about God stuff too. Would you please sketch the scientific way where we can verify that your hypothesis is true itself? And you'll be surprised how much speechlessness there is. And anyone who doubts this, I will offer you this. If you are in any way in education, above all high school or college, get your student government or those who have all these funds to throw around. They're always scheduling criminals and everyone else to lecture on campus for $2,500. Get them to arrange a debate and let anybody who wants to defend the evolutionist side. In other words, let's get their top physicists, biologists, chemists. I will get you people on the other side. And I tell you, it will be a massacre. And you'll have to pay them. I am not. These people are from San Diego, Creation Research Institute. They've debated before 6,000 people in Tennessee. I mean, that's a considerable crowd. And they've gone all around the country debating strictly scientifically, no theology, no philosophy. They simply, and they know their science, they're Protestants. There's a Duane Gish and a Henry Morris. In Michigan, there's a Dr. John Moore, a friend of mine, and these guys are all PhDs or doctors of science. They will go anywhere in the country, anywhere, debate anybody on evolution. And I tell you, that's the sleeper. Because suddenly we're having to put our money where our mouth is. Suddenly all this sloganizing is going to be abruptly halted. So there is a little hope left. I can, of course, get Fordham to schedule the debate, by the way. They're too busy inviting John Dean, people like that. They're still lecturing at Fordham.